In one of my videos, I got this comment right here. It says, "Can you please share your testimony?" So I'm going to do my best to share what happened in my life. It may take a few videos, but I'm going to do my best. Many times people, when you ask them about their sexuality, they can tell you that they remember a time where they struggled with it and trying to find themselves. But for me, I always knew that I was lesbian. I don't remember ever having that conversation in your head, like, should I be this or should I be that or what should I do? I don't think I had that experience. I remember being on the playground in kindergarten and kids were like running around playing, and I remember the little girls would always say, "Oh, look at that boy over there, isn't he cute?" And I couldn't stand that. I thought that's so disgusting. Like, when I grow up, I want to be with a woman. And I remember having a crush on all the little girls in my class. And I never really told people how I felt, though, because everybody around me, all the girls liked boys. And that wasn't who I was. As I got older, I always heard how boys were supposed to be girls and girls were supposed to be boys, and that's just the way it was. So I never really told anybody that I was different. I struggled with having friends, and I didn't want to be any more different than I already was. So I kind of kept that to myself and had my own crushes, but never shared them with anybody. Like, didn't tell my friends. When I was about 14 years old, I started like really, really struggling because everybody else had boyfriends. And so I would occasionally have a boyfriend, but only to like keep it hidden, like keep my secret so that nobody would know that I was different. I came to school and everybody was like, "Oh, you got a boyfriend, and it kind of took, I don't know, that like look off of me that I was different, and I just tried to be more like everyone else. When I got into high school, I fell in love with a girl. I'm not going to give her name, but she was absolutely beautiful and sweet and kind, and I fell in love with her, and I couldn't tell her because she had a boyfriend, and I never like thought that I was good enough to tell her how I felt. So for a very long time, I didn't. So I just tried to go about life. So I was in love with a girl, and she was in a relationship, and she actually ended up marrying that man. And I ended up marrying a man as well because we went to church and they told us that we were wrong to be together, and I never told anybody how I felt because I didn't want them to say how wrong I was. And I met a man who just adored me and was very nice to me, and I always wanted to be a mom, and I always wanted to have a normal life. So we got married. I always wanted to be a mom, so we had 5 children. And many people say to me, "Well, then you were just bisexual, or you were just experimenting, or you just maybe didn't know who you were." But that's not the case. I never enjoyed being with him, ever. I felt like it was invading my body and invading my space. I felt like I was a martyr and that I was sacrificing who I was every single time. Later down the road, I got so tired and depressed from lying about who I was and trying to cover up and trying to do the right things all the time and say the right things that I quit. And I actually called my friend, the same girl from high school. We had been friends for years. And I told her I was done pretending, and she told me to come to her house, and we started a relationship together. And for many, many years we were on and off and on and off, and we would try to be together, and then we would feel convicted and we would stop, but we couldn't control ourselves. And so I was in an affair. I would stay with her for days on end and then go back to my husband so that he could see our kids. And I just tried to pretend everything was okay, but it wasn't. And so we did that for many, many years. And then after a while, she broke it off because she couldn't handle the fact that she was basically sharing me. She couldn't handle the going back and forth. She couldn't handle the conviction. She couldn't handle all that. So she actually broke up with me. And I started a binge of drinking to try to drown out all the feelings that I had. And I stayed drunk for about 6 months after that. And then I started going back to church a lot more. I started getting involved in ministry a lot more. I started giving my heart back to God. And so I stopped drinking for one day. And I went to a wedding with a woman that I was friends with and ended up drinking that evening after only being without alcohol for 24 hours. I started another relationship with another woman that evening. And I had known this woman for a while. I thought she was gorgeous. She was very sweet and kind. We went to a homeschooling association together. So I just gave up and started a relationship with her. Now, this relationship was different. I didn't just stay in the closet. I didn't just keep it to myself. I fell hard. And I was ready to take a leap and go full force into this relationship. So within 2 weeks of our relationship, I moved out of my house with my children and moved in with her. And we lived together. We began raising our kids together. She was a Christian. I was a Christian. And I had finally had life, what I thought was perfect. I finally felt safe. I finally felt secure. I finally had the confidence of who I was. And I was proud to just be me. She loved to worship, and we would play the piano and we would sing together and we would worship God together. And we taught our kids who God was. And this was before the law passed for same-sex marriages. So we actually exchanged rings. We said our vows together. We made a decision to be wives. And I actually, wrong hand, share this with a lot of people. I actually have her wedding band on my hand at all times to remember her. So we exchanged rings, we exchanged vows, and we made a promise to always be there for each other. But honestly, although I was happy and I loved her so much, I loved her more than I'd loved anybody else in my entire life, there was just this part of me, this part of me that knew deep down that something just wasn't right. Something wasn't exactly the way that God wanted it to be. And I had a relationship with God, but I just knew, I knew deep down that it wasn't right. Now, I know that some people are thinking, oh, it's because you were gay. That's why you didn't feel right. But in all honesty, I really felt like the reason that it didn't feel right inside was because we weren't legally married and because I wasn't pursuing a relationship with Jesus Christ. That was the reason I thought things weren't right. Although we were worshiping and teaching our children about God, I didn't really spend one-on-one time with God. I didn't really talk to him or read his word a lot. So I thought that was the issue. So one night I got down on my knees in our living room and I just prayed and I asked God to give me a closer relationship with him because I missed that. I missed feeling him. I missed feeling his presence because although we worshiped and we taught our kids about God, I didn't feel that closeness that I once had, that feeling that I knew that he was always there with me. So I began praying and asking God to give me a relationship with him. And as I was praying, my girlfriend, or my wife, if you want to call her that, after we had exchanged rings, she came in and she got down beside me and she started praying for me. And she got down beside me and she started praying for me. And she was praying for me and praying for me. And all of a sudden, she started praying for me in tongues. And I know that a lot of people might question if that's real or not, but it is. And I had lived with this woman for a year and had never heard her pray in tongues. And she started praying in tongues. And for the first time in my whole life, I knew what she said. I could understand what she was praying. And it wasn't a prayer at the end from her to God. It was God speaking through her. And God said this: if you will step out of the ankle deep water and into the deep, you will have a Saul turn Paul experience. And I just started weeping and crying. And she said, do you know what that means? Do you know what I said? And I said, I do. And before I could tell her what I had heard in my heart, not like an audible voice, but like I could hear it in my heart, before I could tell her, she said, Donna, if we will step out, we'll have a Saul turn Paul experience. And I knew at that moment that I had heard from God, and so did she. And I knew that God was about to do something in our lives. So from that moment of hearing God's voice, I knew that I had to have a closer relationship with him. Now, let me make it perfectly clear. I did not feel guilty for being gay. I didn't have any shame still at all. I'm still confident in who I was. I was still happy to be with a woman, and I still wanted to marry her. So from that moment, I knew that I had to have a closer relationship with God, though. And I looked at her, and she said to me, you know what we need to do? We need to do a fast. And she said, I fasted before. Her dad was a pastor, and I had been in ministry off and on my whole life, but I'd never fasted, but she had. And she said, let's do a 40-day fast. And at the end of 40 days, we'll have a closer relationship with God. And if we still feel not guilty at all, then we're going to go ahead and be legally married, because the same-sex marriage laws had just passed in our state. And so I said, okay, deal. So we started the next day a 40-day fast. She actually did liquids, and I did the Daniel fast. Now, for 10 days, our lives turned upside down. We felt the presence of God in our house. We saw things begin to change. Our kids started acting different in a good way. We started praying for things, and things were just happening. Miracles were happening. We started seeing things that were different. I wasn't drinking. I was smoking pot at the time. And I figured that was all natural, so I would just, it's okay. But we did promise to try to abstain from being together, just because there's a scripture that talks about separating yourselves for prayer and fasting in the Bible, that it's okay to not be with your spouse. So we wanted to focus on God, and also we wanted to obey by the rules that we were taught about who God wanted us to be during the fast. So on the 10th day, though, I actually was high, and I was praying, and all of our kids were praying, and out of her mouth came this bold proclamation in tongues. You know that voice in church where you know that it's God and that he's very angry? I heard her speak in tongues, and then she gave the interpretation, and it said, all things must submit to me. God said, all things must submit to me. And I know that a lot of people say that something traumatic happened to them while they were drunk, and all of a sudden they were sober. And I know that sounds crazy, but I was high, praying. And this came out, and I was sober. I was more sober than I had ever been in my whole life. And I have not touched any drugs since that moment. I had to submit, because that voice was so strong and so with so much authority and power that I had to give it up. I can't even go back because when I hear it inside my head still, it terrifies me. And so I haven't touched drugs since that day. And after that moment, I realized that I was fasting all wrong because I wasn't drinking anymore, but I was still watching things I shouldn't have been watching, dreaming of things I shouldn't have been dreaming. I had a relationship with the woman during our fast that I was trying to resist. So I said, let's start again. And she did too. She said, let's do a 40-day fast. And let's do it a more deeper. No more drugs. And let's seek him with all of our heart. So she actually started drinking only water only. And we started day 1 again on day 10. So day 1 again. And I started liquids only for 40 days. So we started seeing even more miracles happen. We saw a bone that was right here. It was like sticking up. Her little boy fell down the steps and it was kind of like sticking up and you could tell it was broken. We put our hands on it. We prayed over him and God actually healed that. We got to pray over people and they would be healed. We were praying over people walking down the road and their lives were changed. And God began speaking to us and showing us things in the Bible that we had once not understood, but suddenly we were understanding it again. And once again, we never felt guilty about being together, though. We did feel guilty when we would fall into temptation because it was during the fast. So we felt like we shouldn't be having that relationship while fasting. But we never felt that it was wrong to be together until the 40th day, the very last day. So it was actually 40 days from the very beginning that we had decided to fast. And on that day, our lives actually completely changed. So we had 10 days left because remember we restarted. But this was the 40th day. So in all we fasted 50 days. So on the 40th day of the fast, we were so excited. We had set the next day to go get our marriage license, and we knew that we were going to change the world. We knew that we were going to go into churches and we were going to proclaim God's word and we were going to tell them how we fasted and we prayed and we saw miracles and we saw God change our lives and we had a relationship with him and we heard his voice and I had heard tongues and God had given me the gift of interpretation and she was singing and writing music and God had changed our whole lives around and we were so excited to be legally married. So we thought we would finish out the night watching some videos about some prayer and people's lives being changed. And the next day we would go get our marriage license. And we decided to crawl in bed and turn on a movie. We were watching a YouTube video about a kid who had supposedly died and came back to life and what he was saying. And he had said that all sin was the same and that God had looked at all sin across the board as the same. It didn't matter if you murdered somebody or you told a white lie. Like to God, it really hurt God. He never mentioned anything about same-sex attraction, homosexuality, nothing like that. That wasn't even what the video was about. And I remember thinking we have hours left. Hours till midnight. It was just her and I in the house, and our kids were gone. And I thought, tomorrow I get to marry this woman. I was so, so happy that God had not given me a conviction. And within just a few minutes of watching that movie, I got on my knees in our bed, and she did the same, and we began to pray if there was anything in us that God saw as wrong. And we wanted to sincerely seek God. I sincerely wanted God to remove anything out of me that didn't please him. And so, as I was on my knees, I had my eyes closed, and I was praying, and she was praying beside me. And with my eyes closed, I saw almost like a movie playing. And it was of me. And I could see me there. And then I could see Jesus Christ on the cross. And he was up, nailed to a cross before my eyes. So I was on my knees. And I saw myself, and then I saw a cross with Jesus hanging on it. And I saw him get hit with a whip, and I saw a skin tear. And as it did, I saw like a bubble pop up above him. And on cartoons where you can see what they're thinking, they have those little thought bubbles. Well, what I saw wasn't really a thought. It was an actual event that happened in my life. And it was in this bubble above him as he got every strike of a whip. And I saw a lie that I told my mom. And I saw me stealing a hacky sack from Six Flags in 8th grade. And I saw things that I had done, like drinking and drugs, and I saw my affair on my husband. I saw things that I had done to people, and Jesus was getting whipped for what I had done. And it made me so broken, because I don't ever want to hurt him. And I began weeping. And I started asking God, please forgive me for those things that I did that hurt you. And then I saw that woman that was beside me, the woman that I called my wife. I saw her and I in bed together. And I saw Jesus take a lash for that. And I had never felt true shame about being gay. It was who I was. It was a part of me, and I had tried to change it so many times, so many years. I begged God to change it. But I always asked him to change it for me, so that people wouldn't look down on me. Because I wasn't ashamed of who I was, but I was ashamed of how people saw me. And so I always asked God to fix me for me, so that people wouldn't think that I was a bad person, or people wouldn't not want to be around me, or the church folks wouldn't say that I would go to hell. But at that moment, seeing him up there, for the first time in my life, I felt something different. I no longer wanted to change because of the way people looked at me, or for my kids, or for their dad who was so good to me. I no longer wanted to change because society said it was wrong. At that moment, I felt as if me doing those things was breaking God's heart. And I don't want to ever do that. God has brought me through so much in life, and I've seen miracles happen. And another video, but I saw my daughter be raised from the dead. I know that he's God, and I don't want to hurt him. So for the first time in my whole life, I felt conviction for the lifestyle that I'd been living. So I asked God to forgive me. Forgive me for the desires that I had. Forgive me for wanting to be with another woman. And to forgive me for wanting to be her wife. Because if it hurts God, then I don't want any part of it. And I made a vow to God that if he would forgive me, that I would never be with a woman again. And I didn't care how much I wanted it, or how much it made me feel safe and secure, or how it made me feel whole and safe. I would just be single the rest of my life if he would just forgive me. After about 20 minutes of me crying, I sat up and I looked at her, and she said, "We're wrong, aren't we?" I said, I think we are. I think we're wrong, and I don't think we can do this. And she said, I can't legally marry you, but I can be your friend and we can raise our kids together. We can't do this anymore. And so I grabbed her and I hugged her and I held her tight, and I was prepared to resist the temptation to be with her. But when I hugged her, I didn't feel that anymore. I felt like I was hugging my sister. I felt like she was my best friend, and that is all I felt. So this woman and I grabbed each other. We held each other and cried, and I didn't have to resist. My body wasn't responding like it used to, and I felt such a close connection with her, but that was all. I didn't want to be your wife anymore. I just wanted to be your best friend. And I felt like a new person. Like, I felt something I'd never felt before. And I didn't want her anymore. I had prayed this prayer so many times, and I always came out the same. I was gay no matter what. But on that day, I really truly believe that God delivered me because I wanted it for him, and I was prepared to do whatever it took to please him. And if it meant abstaining the rest of my life, I was going to do it. And I meant it. And so God delivered me of homosexuality that night. And he delivered her too. And we felt something we had never felt before. This bond, this closeness, this best friends without an attraction. And it was so different. It was something that I can't even explain, but it felt amazing. It felt like a deeper love, and I didn't even think I could love her any more than I had already had, and I did. I loved her so much more, and God just took us and stuck us together. God changed my life that night. And for the next 10 days, we still continued our fast. She drank water only still. I drank juice and liquids only to complete our now 50-day fast. And during those 10 days, I never, ever had a desire to be with a man. I didn't have a desire to be with my husband, my ex-husband. We were divorced. I just had planned on raising my kids with this woman and going to churches and telling our testimony. And so I studied a lot of the Bible, and God started revealing himself to me of who he was and how he loved me and what he had done for me and how he could help others. And I started studying out baptism. And on the very last day of our fast, that 50th day, I went down to an ice cold river. It was on April 14th in Missouri, and it was cold, and there was still a little snow on the ground. And her dad was a pastor, and he was going to baptize me, but he ended up getting an emergency on the way, and he had baptized her a couple weeks prior to this. After God delivered us, she had her dad baptize her. And so I went down the river to be baptized, and he had an emergency. So he asked her, my now ex-girlfriend, who had been delivered and had fasted and prayed, to baptize me. And so on April 14th, 2016, God allowed me to be baptized by the woman that I fasted with. And by the woman that was, a godly woman and had been delivered of homosexuality and had fasted for 40 days. It was on the 40th day of water only, or 50th day of the fast. And she got to baptize me in Jesus' name. And that is the most amazing thing that I thought could ever happen. But God didn't stop there. So my kids all gave their life to Christ. Her kids did, and we were prepared to live together as friends because I was legally divorced. I didn't want to be with a man. My ex-husband and I had 50-50 custody of our kids, and life seemed to be in this place where we were going to find some normalcy. We would tell our testimony and raise our kids together. Just a few days after the fast ended, my ex-husband came over, and he didn't seem annoying, and he looked different. And he seemed such a good dad, and things that I had not saw in him, and he was so nice and kind to me and to her, and he loved her and our kids, and he just started seeming different. And then God told me to start praying for him a wife. So I fasted and I prayed for 3 days. Water only. Now, mind you, I'd just been off this other fast and I'd only eaten for a few days. God told me water only for 3 days. So I began praying for him a wife. I began praying for someone who would laugh at his jokes. Someone who would want to cook for him. Someone who would see him for him. Who would love him for who he was. Who would find joy in his talents because he can paint and he loves to sing and he loves to tell jokes and he's so funny. And I began praying for a woman who would be a good mom to my kids. Someone who would love their dad and show them how a relationship and a marriage was supposed to work. And on the third day, God said to me, "You need to marry him." And I never thought for a minute, not for 1 minute, I would ever want to be married to a man. I never purposely kissed him. I never wanted him. I'd never done any of those things. He had always kissed me, but I had never just leaned over and kissed him or anything like that. I was a lesbian my whole life. I never wanted to be with a man. And when God told me that, I didn't think that I could do it. I didn't want to be with women, but I had never wanted a man before. And my now best friend came to me without me telling her, and she said the same thing, that she had been praying and she felt like God had showed her Ruth, the verse in the Bible where Naomi looks at Ruth and says, "It's time to get you a husband." So after fasting those 3 days for his wife, I wanted to invite him over for dinner. So I called him and I asked him to come over and have dinner for us. And we hadn't had dinner with us and our kids in a very, very long time. My vehicle broke down. So I asked him if I could use his vehicle to go get some food, and I wanted to cook him dinner, and I wanted him to come have dinner with my kids and her kids and him. And so he said I could use his vehicle, just drop him off at work. So I go and I went to drop him off at work, and I jumped out of his van and I ran around to the driver's seat and I went to get in, and he kind of leaned over to me and, he just was going to shut the door for me. And I don't really know what happened. I just kind of leaned over at the same time and I kissed him. Now, mind you, I'd never purposely kissed a man before, nor did I ever want to. But I kissed him. And you know how movies, when people kiss and there's like fireworks or you see the person's belly and there's like little butterflies in their belly, and I'm just like, whatever, that never happens. If I could describe it as something, it was fireworks. Fireworks went off everywhere. And I felt something for him. A love that I can't even explain. So he's like, what was that? He said, can I do it again? I thought, why not? The first one was pretty good, but I didn't say that. I was like, oh, yeah, if you want. So he leaned over and he kissed me again, and I knew at that moment that I wanted to spend the rest of my life with this man. A man. I wanted to spend the rest of my life with this man. And so he said, what are we doing? And I said, well, why don't you come over for dinner tonight, and I'll tell you. So I picked him up from work and drove him to my house for dinner that night. Our first official date after we were divorced. So I invited my husband over. We all sat down for dinner. First time we'd all been together in a very, very long time. And I asked him to pray over our food, and he did. And then I said I had something to say. And there's an ending to Fireproof where the girl tells Caleb how much she wants to be a part of his life and how she's seen God change his life, and she wants it for her. And I pretty much quoted that movie at the very end, except for I said, God's done a work in my life, and I want him to do it in ours. And then at the end I said, is it too late to ask you to grow old with me? Will you marry me? And to my surprise, the man didn't even think. He just said, yes, of course. And I never thought in a million years that I would be excited about that moment. That was truly one of the happiest moments of my entire life. I dropped to my knees and in his arms and wept, and my now ex-girlfriend, best friend, was home and holding the camera and recording, and she's weeping and she's so excited. She was so happy. And I was happy to marry a man. So just a little over a week, almost 2 weeks later, we were able to get married. She was my maid of honor, and her kids and my kids were our wedding party. And I married a man. And that day I gave myself to a man, truly and wholeheartedly. And I've honestly never regretted it.